Welcome, everybody, to another exciting panel talking about ridgetop to river mouth. And for this panel, we're actually talking about reactivation of floodplains. And we're going to be joined today by Megan Hurdle, Director of Land and Water Conservation from Audubon, Jacob Katz, Senior Scientist at Caltrout, and Louis Baer, General Manager of RD 108. And welcome, everybody. I'd really like to spend a little bit of time here this afternoon just laying out the science, right? Let's lay out the science, give everybody a quick background, and then we'll move into a panel discussion. So I think today we'll start off with Jacob Katz giving us a little bit of the fish view, switch that to Megan to talk about birds, and then we'll punt that back to Louis Baer to talk about infrastructure. So with that, let me introduce Jacob Katz.
Thanks, Roger. Pleasure to be here this morning or afternoon or evening. No, okay. This is recorded. Hi, I am Senior Scientist at California Trout, and I just want to give a brief overview about the kind of science of rivers and how they function, especially in the Sacramento Valley. So with that, I'm going to turn to a couple slides. So Roger's asked me to just give a little summary about how the Sacramento River Valley works, the physical function of the river valley, and how the natural processes, especially how water flowing across the landscape, really facilitates the flow of energy, the flow of matter into biomass. What do we mean by biomass? Well, obviously, biomass are the crops that are produced on farmland in summer, but we're also talking about wildlife, about the incredible biomass of geese darkening the sky or fish filling these rivers. So salmon, ducks, geese, those are all the predictable outcome of a series of decisions that we make on the landscape. So we're trying to cultivate these ecological solutions for both fish and wildlife on the working agricultural landscape, on this mosaic of different kinds of farm fields in the Sacramento Valley. And we do that by mimicking the natural processes that once made the Sacramento Valley one of the great wildlife landscapes on Earth. And we all here believe that we can be so again, that it needn't be one or the other, but we can have fins, feathers, and farms, and flood control all within the Sacramento Valley through the portfolio of solutions that we'll be talking about today, from the headwaters to the river mouth, from the ridgetop to the river mouth. So I'm not going to make this too complicated, right? It really isn't rocket science, but it is physics, right? You remember this guy? See his hair? This really is about the flow of energy from solar energy from the sun and carbon in the air. Plants take those two things and make the foundation of the food web, of a functioning ecosystem. What is that? It's plant matter, right? Plant matter it's making complex carbohydrates, it's making lignins, it's all these different ways of trapping sunlight, right? It's a battery, and it's the floodplains, which are the solar collector for river ecosystems, right? When we lose our floodplains, as we have by levying more than 95% of them in the Central Valley, where we're really at around 5% of our functioning floodplains, we shouldn't be surprised that we're at around 5% of our native fish biomass as well. We've really taken the batteries out of the system. But as we'll talk about today, we can put them back in. We can refuel, reactivate our floodplains, and that will refuel and bring back, re-energize our the Sacramento River's aquatic ecosystem. And how does that work? Well, sunlight, right, is captured by plants out on the floodplain itself in summer. But in winter, when the flood waters spread out and slow down, well, then you have a much larger solar surface to catch that sunlight, and that happens by algae floating near the surface of the water. So whether it's algae or plants, it's the same process. Photosynthesis captures that summer and that winter sunlight. It is stored in that green matter, and then you have to spread the water out. You have to slow it down to allow enough time for microbes and bacteria to break that matter down, right? Or the phytoplankton to be eaten by zooplankton. Either way, it's about flooding. It's about mimicking that natural long duration, weeks, even months, that the water puddled up on the landscape. So sunlight makes plants. Plants are eaten by bugs. The bugs then are eaten by small fish, which very rapidly become much larger fish. And that's a really important factor that we're talking about here, because it doesn't happen instantaneously. It does take a little bit of time. Around 3 weeks or so of water spreading out over the floodplain is what allows a fish to go from a little itty bitty thing like this. This is how big they are on stocking day if we're putting these fish out into agricultural floodplains, into rice fields and other kinds of fields where the water has been held so that it mimics the kind of puddle that would have happened out there naturally. By puddle, I mean wetland, right? Wet land. We're talking about the very simple process of mimicking the marshes and wetlands that were here previously, right? So this kind of simple idea of puddles having incredible power, and that power comes from residence time. It means that the river is moving really quickly through the system, and it doesn't allow these aquatic food webs to set up, right? But if you spread it, if you slow it, and remember that when you slow water across the floodplain, you actually sink it too, recharging our critical groundwater aquifers, but you're also growing this energy source that keeps a small fish like the one at the top of this picture, which really the Feather River, the Yuba River, the Upper Sacramento River can produce literally 100 million fish that look like that top one in a good year. But the problem is they're stuck inside a levee. They really have very little food within that thin blue line between rip-rapped steep levees that we call the river. But when that river has access to wetlands and the fish can swim out of the river into those rich, food-rich habitats, then you get a fish like the one on the bottom. Those two fish are the same age. One has spent its life in the river. The other one had 3 weeks out on the floodplain. So why does that happen? Well, it's really a food thing, right? Each one of these beakers represents a cubic meter of water. So just 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, right? And in the Sac River, there's very few bugs within that cubic meter of water. In the canal, which represents how water flows across the floodplain during most of the time, right, in summer, just on the other side of the levee from the river, this canal water has 6 times more food. That's incredible. But look at the beaker on the left. It's solid. That gold tan color you're looking at is pure protein. That is natural wealth. That is the capacity of residence time to make the bugs, which then, of course, make fish, right? So the water in the Sacramento River is turning over every couple seconds. The water in the canal is turning over every couple minutes. The water on the floodplain in these managed fields is turning over every couple days. And that difference, that's the difference between night and day. That's the difference between a Sac River that is a food desert and a Sac River that has enough food to create robust populations of salmon, of smelt, of other native fish. So I want you to know that while we've made 95% of the former floodplain inaccessible, it's not gone, right? The landscape is still here. This is a picture from William Hammond Hall. It's one of the first maps of the Sacramento. Well, not one of the very first. You can see Marysville's right there, but this is 1888, right? This is way back there. And the shaded regions that you see in the middle, those represent the tules, the wetlands in the flood basins of the Sutter and the Colusa, the southern part going into Yolo. And check this out. When we overlay that with Google imagery from today, can you see that? You can still see the 5 o'clock shadow in that same place. Those dark lines, those are the rich marsh soils, often where we grow rice now, which is to say that we can reactivate this floodplain. We have the capacity to just tweak the way in which we're managing it, where we can still produce amazing robust population, harvest for people, agricultural harvest for people in the summer. But in the off season, those same habitats can be extraordinarily productive for ducks, for geese. And now we're learning how to do that same natural wealth and make sure that it's applied to making fish populations as well. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Megan Hurdle.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate that. I think this is the first time I've ever heard anyone refer to a floodplain as a 5 o'clock shadow. I think maybe there's some branding that we can pick up on that. I've got a couple of slides to show as well. I'm going to pull those up now. So Jacob told you a little bit about why the Sacramento Valley is particularly important for fish and new ways that we can think about operating the system that both continues to support farmers, but also helps rebuild our fish population. I'm going to talk a little bit about the birds. And so hopefully for those of you who have actually managed to get out of your house during these past months, you've seen scenes like this all over the Sacramento Valley. Dense congregations of water birds that are coming here as part of their winter migratory journey. And they're using flooded agricultural fields, and they're using our last remaining wetlands and natural areas. And these birds are part of an incredible migration. So 70% of North American birds migrate, which means they're moving between their breeding grounds in summer to their wintering grounds. Some of these birds are traveling thousands of miles from places as far away as the Arctic to the tip of South America. And along their journey, they're stopping to rest, refuel, to eat before they continue. And some birds are actually going and staying in places to overwinter, like the Central Valley of California. And we are an incredible spot along this migratory route. Unfortunately, what we're seeing is that this migratory journey is becoming harder and harder for birds. And it's harder for a lot of reasons. We don't have the same amount of habitat that we've had before. So Jacob referenced this in his presentation. We've lost about 90 to 95% of our natural habitat in the Central Valley. So that's historic floodplains, that's riverside forests, that's wetland complexes. We're also seeing extreme events driven by climate change like fire and drought, limiting the amount of food and places these birds can go. And of course, human use of land and development is also restricting the amount of habitat they have. And unfortunately, you see these results in the crashing number of birds. So this is from a study that Cornell released about a year ago that showed that in the last 50 years, we have 3 billion fewer birds than we had historically. 50 years, I mean, that's one human lifetime to see bird declines across all populations. And it's not just the endangered and threatened birds that we're seeing decline in. It's common birds like your western meadowlark or your red-winged blackbird. But it's not a complete story of loss. So if you look at this slide, you can see that there is one bird group, the waterfowl populations, that are actually increasing over the last 50 years. And that is due in large part to work from groups like Ducks Unlimited, Audubon, and many others in partnership with private landowners to actually protect and enhance private lands for these birds. So you don't have to look any further than the Sacramento Valley to understand that. So if you look at this map of the full Central Valley, you can see that our last remaining habitat areas, which are represented in the bright red, orange, and blue, they're basically postage stamps in the Central Valley. But if you zoom into the Sacramento Valley, you can really see how the complex of rice, which is in the green, surrounds these last remaining wetlands areas and is oftentimes providing surrogate habitat for water birds, particularly for waterfowl. And in most years, we are seeing that 2/3 of the wintering waterfowl diet in the Sacramento Valley is coming from these rice fields. So it's really showing the importance of thinking about the landscape as a whole, operating our wetlands and our agricultural lands where we can to benefit birds and other species. So Audubon just released this study 2 weeks ago. We often think about the importance of the Sacramento Valley for water birds, but what we're finding is it's also really important for land birds. So this is a pretty cool graphic from eBird that shows the distribution of tree swallows as they migrate through North America and south. And what you're really going to see here is just how much the Central Valley pops. So our study is showing that we've got 28 million tree swallows alone that are coming through here. It's really tremendous. And so we need to think about providing the food resources when and where these birds need it. And that's why Audubon, for more than a decade, has been working in this landscape in partnership with other NGOs through the Migratory Bird Conservation Partnership, particularly TNC and Point Blue Conservation Science, along with landowners, agencies, and industry groups like the California Rice Commission. And our goal really is to protect those last remaining wetlands, ensure they've got the water they need, but then also to think about that rice landscape and the surrounding landscape and reactivating it to create food for birds and now also for fish, while still maintaining this area as a vibrant place to live and grow food. Now, we know this is really important, right? It's not just the sheer number of birds that are coming here, but we are entering another set of dry years. During the last drought, Point Blue Conservation Science did a study that showed that some of the water that was put on agricultural lands to create surrogate habitat was actually the only available habitat for birds on several days during the drought. This just shows how important it is to partner with landowners to think about creative ways to reoperate farms and landscapes to benefit birds, fish, and people. Now, I like to end with this slide because for me, this represents everything the Sacramento Valley is and what it can be in the future. It shows a productive agricultural landscape. You see surrogate habitat with shorebirds in the foreground using it. There's wetland complexes in the background. This is the future we can have. Now, it's not to say we're not going to have to make hard choices about land use and about water, but there are places on this landscape where we can work together to recreate ecosystem function, to create a resilient flood system, and to also provide habitat for birds and fish and more. And so with that, I'm actually going to pass it to Lewis, who's going to give you some examples of those habitat types.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Megan. So I think Jacob and Megan have really done a great job to lay out the science and, a good picture of the landscape and just how important floodplains are. What I really want to talk to you about is just what we mean. I mean, how do we get from, all these great things or where we are today to all these great benefits that we talk about, kind of an improved Sacramento Valley habitat picture. I'm sure a lot of folks on the ground are worried about things it's doing right now. There's a lot of great things going on right now and important things. So I want to share with you our thoughts and really what we've learned from the YOLO bypass approach and how we can possibly apply that in the Sacramento Valley, kind of north of that YOLO bypass. So how do we do this on a landscape scale? So this map here is a map that shows the flood system, frankly, and the blue areas are areas that already get wet. And we're really fortunate in the Sac Valley and that, frankly, it's a place where we had plentiful water. But that also meant that it was too much water to manage during those winter months. And so what the map shows you right now is what floodplains still get wet. So this is the area that still gets activated. But what's different is that we have river connections that don't act like they did historically. Our old sloughs used to be at a much lower elevation. And when the river would start to rise, they would flow much more frequently. They'd flow earlier on flood events. Our current weirs are much higher, and so they now restrict that from happening. So really, when we talk about the Sacramento Valley and the Butte Sink and the Sutter Bypass and the Colusa Basin, largely what we're talking about is changing those river connections that I just spoke about, kind of those sloughs that are now either plugged off completely or converted to weirs, or the infrastructure within those floodplains. Jacob talked about how it takes time for water on the landscape to be productive. 3 weeks or so is what we've seen in some of our fish food studies where we've grown fish food in rice fields. Our current drainage system and the infrastructure within the floodplain just rapidly drains water off of the landscape. So how would we reoperate that during the winter months so that we could get the productivity that they talked about? And then finally, what do our farm fields look like? What do the existing wetlands look like? And how do we make sure that we're not taking away from the great things that those existing managed wetlands or refuges are providing today? And how do we look at those farm fields and see how during those winter months they may operate in a way that helps support the fishery, that helps support the wildlife, that in turn can help support water supply reliability? So what does that really look like in a system where you're trying to modernize it? And I think the 2 points that I find I get the most questions on are, when are we talking about doing this? And first of all, it's in the non-farm season. And it's not because we're just trying to avoid the farm season. It's frankly because that's when the flood benefits traditionally happen. So November or December through about March 1st are the times that we're talking about additional reactivation of these floodplains. And then secondly, it's kind of within the hydrograph. So as the rivers start to increase in flow and then drop back down, when are we really reoperating the system? And I think this, from a flood control perspective, which my agency is hyper focused on, is public safety and flood protection. We're not talking about during the times when the river is really running heavy. Really what we're talking about is when the river is starting to overtop the weirs, to lower flows when it could still exit through a historic slough, but now can't because we have weirs in place. So really we're talking about, could we take those weirs or other similar structures, modify those so they're operable from that weir overtopping location down to what the historic sloughs used to operate like. And then we'd be able to manage those flows to try to manage the benefits and potential impacts to folks on the floodplain side. So these are locations that already get wet, generally already have fish on the floodplain. And what we're trying to do is increase the frequency, increase the duration during those kind of moderate to lower flows during the winter months when we're not flooding or we're not farming. So this clearly will take a lot of people. The map that I showed you is about 200,000 acres in the Sacramento Valley. Those lands in the lower Colusa Basin or in the Butte Sink or the Sutter Bypass, they're really, really critical. And it's not by accident that this slide on the left-hand side starts with landowners, farmers, private wetlands, public refuges. These rural communities and the state and federal lands that occupy this footprint are critical. They're absolutely the place that this program starts and what can be done or can't be done. But there's also other groups of folks that are really energized about this and see the benefits. NGOs, folks like Megan and Jacob, bring a lot of expertise to this and help advise folks on how this can be done. They have a lot of energy on how we move these things forward. And then you have the agencies, state and federal agencies that are in charge of either protecting or improving federal and state species. You have the tribal, you have the county folks, water users, levee districts, all folks wanting to see multiple benefits coming from this same group of land while providing respect, frankly, for the landowners that are already in place. So we're trying to maximize kind of that third season. You know, we have the farm season, we kind of have a waterfowl season, but we're really looking at that third overwinter season where we think we can provide additional benefits on those same lands. So how do we make it happen? Well, we need to assemble the folks that we just talked about. We need to strengthen the partnership. And what I mean by that is we need to help each other understand each other's properties, what things are happening on the landscape right now. We need to take from the YOLO bypass effort, we need to learn that strong open communications and engagement with the landowners, with the agencies, with the NGOs has to be a critical component of this. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. We really need to live in each other's shoes in order for this to work. And we need to respect each other's current activities. Interagency coordination, there are a lot of agencies that have roles to fulfill in this footprint. And understanding how all of those work together is really important and sometimes can be difficult to navigate when you don't live in that world. So this is really an important aspect of our potential success and being able to move forward. One focus that I mentioned before, but we plan to work early with landowners as a cornerstone as part of this program. And the first funding agreement that we have in place for this, there's a Prop 68 $6 million funding grant that's been provided to advance this concept, has a portion of that funding to provide technical services for landowners, specifically looking at if doing something like this would create an impact on their land, are there physical solutions that can help remedy that? It also provides funding for those same landowners to look at concepts that might help improve or achieve the goals of the team overall. Okay, so what are the steps to actually take a look at this? Well, first of all, we have a lot of models that look at flood protection. You know, how do you provide the public safety? But we don't have models that really look at those mid to low flows across our floodplain. So we need to develop that tool, and we expect that'll take about 12 months to develop a low flow model across this 200,000 acre footprint. We need to develop measurable criteria. So what are the things? I mean, there's magic words here that we all use: testable hypothesis, measurable criteria. What it really means is, what are we trying to achieve, and how are we going to determine whether or not we've achieved that? So that takes people getting together and agreeing on what those things are, not just suggesting what they think would be important. We will use that criteria and those models to create some scenarios, and those scenarios will be evaluated then, and then kind of evaluated on an iterative basis to come up with some preferred alternatives. Those preferred alternatives will then be rolled up into a summary report that looks at how would you implement that and what are really the next steps. And that's how we'll wrap this all up together. So thank you, and I look forward to the upcoming conversation.
All right, thank you guys. That was really good. You know, it's good to see the vision, that we have some leaders here in the Sac Valley that are really trying to push a vision of a better valley. But you know, I really miss the interaction with an audience, and I know you guys do too. I know that's the kind of the part of the presentation that we really thrive on. But what I thought we'd do is take a few minutes right now and just throw around some questions and some ideas to try to flush this out a little bit more. And one of them, you know, maybe I'll start with Lewis. And you know, we talk about 200,000 acres, Lewis. That's what your map showed. But is that enough? Is that all that's needed, or is there more?
Yeah, I think the 200,000 acres I was talking about is really what we call the wet side. And that's a side where it's synonymous with fish access. So I do think there are other acres in the Sacramento Valley that could be brought to bear as well. We have some dry side activities that we all talk about, and that's where we can use land where we don't have fish access to produce food and drain that food back into our river system. That used to happen on a lot of those lands historically, and I think the combination, frankly, of 200,000 acres that's much more frequently inundated and is really working like it did historically, combined with surrogate food production that's draining back into our system, would be the biggest change that we've seen in the Sacramento Valley in a long, long time. The thing that I think about, frankly, is a CDFW study that was done in 1930 and really just documented some data on commercial salmon harvest. And when the flood control system was completed, we lost approximately 80% of our commercial harvest of salmon. And what that tells me is the salmon just weren't available. And what we had done at that point is we had cut the river system off from the floodplains. We hadn't built rim dams largely. We hadn't done many of the other activities. We didn't have the massive urbanization. This was from 1920 to 1930, but we did successfully complete our flood control system. And so it tells me if we can unwind that, and we lost 80% of the fish when we completed that, there is a real opportunity to make a big difference by turning those wheels back.
Hey, Raja, I'd love to add on that. I mean, what Lewis is really talking about here is recreating the function of the ecosystem that we had historically. And what's really amazing about this is birds and fish evolve together. So if we can recreate or mimic what was there historically, in theory, we're going to benefit birds and fish simultaneously. And Audubon and others are really excited to be partnering with CalTrout to measure some of the bird response on those fish food practices that they're doing.
Thanks, Megan, for jumping in there. Jacob, we've been working together for a long time. This group right here has just been dynamite for the Sac Valley. But you know, I always often take little pieces away from every time you give a talk, and we talk about the wet side of the levee, and you know, it floods, right? The bypasses are there for for a huge volume of water. But what is really the biggest bang for our buck? Is it on a dry year like this to have reoperable weirs, or is it really those big wet years?
Well, I think that we all know that there's no silver bullets, right, Raj? I mean, it's about this portfolio approach. It's about making sure that, as Megan was just saying, that native critters, whether they have wings or they swim, right, whether they have fins or feathers, or, you know, quite frankly, whether they slither too, right? All of our native creatures are adapted to the physical patterns of the landscape. In this case, it's California. It couldn't be more stark. It does not rain in the summer. It doesn't. Every summer is a drought, right? So these animals are particularly honed by the landscape and by the patterns of climate to have life histories, to have life history strategies, basically to have keys to the landscape's lock, right? And so the question about what's the biggest bang for your buck is really a question about understanding how animals used the landscape historically, understanding how the landscape has changed since those times through European development, and then thinking about, again, as Megan said, how do we not fundamentally change our infrastructure, our levees, our dams, our roads, our diversions, but how do we reoperate them in such a way that we can approximate those historical patterns? And I think the easiest way of thinking about that is allowing fish to recognize the rivers that they're adapted to, that they evolved under, right? And we have such incredible precedent for how dramatic the population level response is if you allow an animal or a population to recognize the systems that they're adapted to. And that's Megan's slides that were just basically all white or salt and pepper. And you have to zoom in to see that it's solid snow geese. This incredible capacity that the Central Valley, that the Sacramento Valley has to produce migratory birds that has been demonstrated over the last 30 years, where we went from really all-time low numbers to year after year seeing this kind of increase. That green arrow she was talking about with waterfowl populations, it's not just in the Sac Valley, it's in the other flyways throughout the continent. We really see now that if we can manage at that landscape scale, where birds that for 100 years had looked down at a Sacramento Valley that had been managed to be dry during winter, and suddenly in the early 90s, the Pacific Flyway bloomed beneath their wings. Why? Because rice started to reflood their fields after harvest. These kinds of tweaks to how we do business that allow native critters to recognize their environments are so big. So that was maybe a little bit too much of a context, Roger, but the biggest thing we can do is weave together a portfolio of management practices that allow fish to get to each kind of habitat that they need to complete each critical part of their life history, life cycle. So that means that we need enough cold water coming out of dams at the top of the system. We're really working on that. We also need spawning gravels beneath those dams. We're doing a great job on that. We're going to continue to do that. Side channel and other kind of habitats in the upper Sacramento, below Orville Dam on the Feather, in the Yuba River, really important, right? Fundamentally, as Lewis was just saying, access to the pantry, access to the larder, access to the kind of the pit stop that is the floodplain, as these small fish are headed from where they're born in the upper river to the ocean where they're going to spend the majority of their life, is absolutely critical and is the missing link at this point. So building those gates in our floodplains that allow fish from the Feather River, from Butte Creek, from the upper Sacramento, from the Yuba to access Sutter and Yolo bypasses is by far the greatest population level bang we're going to get. But it has to work in conjunction with what Lewis was calling the dry side work. And that's to say, we have 100,000 acres within our bypasses, maybe a little bit more, but the majority of that former floodplain is on the protected side of levees. That doesn't mean that that former floodplain doesn't have a really important role to play in bringing back fish. And that's because we can grow fish food in that winter window that Lewis was talking about, and actively drain that incredible natural production back into the rivers at exactly the right place and the right time, where fish that are basically stuck in a food desert can take advantage of that critical and abundant food resource.
That was awesome. Thank you, Jacob. But you know, we do need to kind of wrap it up here. So I'd like to go through with each one of you for one final thought before we close, and I'll just go ahead and start with the Hollywood Squares. Megan, hate to put you on the spot to be first, but do you have one last takeaway for the group?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the success we've seen with birds has really come from a few things. It's trust, building trust, right, where there wasn't trust before, good communication, going out and doing the science to prove what works for farms and birds, and then working with agencies to implement it at scale. So I know that's not one thing, but it's sort of the secret sauce recipe that we're trying to replicate now for fish and across the Sac Valley as a whole.
All right, awesome. All right, Lewis, one final thought to close this up.
Yeah, I would ask folks on the existing footprint to be patient with us and to understand that we have a great deal of respect for what you currently use your property for, and we're working on ways where we can integrate with what you're already doing. We plan on working with you directly and patiently, and providing you with the resources you need to try to see what you can do to contribute even more than you already do. So you're key to anything happening here, and we'll look forward to working with you.
All right, Jacob, one final thought.
I think I already took up my time, but the first is just saying everything Megan said. Yes, amen. You know, and Lewis as well. I mean, this is really about understanding that, yes, we have to preserve the best of what we have left. Absolutely, that's critical. But ultimately, it's insufficient to rebound these endangered populations, because the majority of not just the Sacramento Valley, but the whole surface of the earth is now really influenced, if not actively managed, by people. So welcoming the wild back into our working landscapes is really the foundation to bringing back birds, to bringing back fish, but it's also to making sure that we as Californians, you know, don't live in fear every summer of catastrophic wildfire. We have the same kind of idea of integrating a knowledge of nature back into the natural resources that we manage. That's just absolutely critical to, I think, you know, kind of a rebirth of the California dream. We have a real chance here to make something that is not just of importance to the Sacramento Valley. I think it's a model for California as a whole, but then I think really the California can be a model for the globe. So it's just such a pleasure and a privilege to get to work with partners like Lewis and Megan and many more that we can't name here, to try to put forward this vision of a functioning Sac Valley that works for both wildlife and for people.
Well, great panel, guys. Thank you again. You know, I do always get inspired every time we do this. I know this is kind of, we've been doing this for a while, but I really appreciate you guys taking the time. And, you know, one thing I would like to say to everybody at NCWA is, you know, I think the Sacramento Valley made a big change, and that was, you know, in the 90s when we stopped burning rice fields and went to flooding. And, you know, maybe this is the next big move that we get to do. So, you know, we all need to take a brave step forward and really work together, work collaboratively, and we can become a model, not only for California, but like Jacob said, for the rest of the world.